tossing, turning, staying up all night long. Just want you by my side.
Chapter 22. Death did not often indulge in the use of pensieves. Why would he? He could recall every moment of every second of his innumerable eons of existence in perfect detail whenever he so chose, so what good did a pensieve do him? He found the pensieves of this era to be the technological equivalent of crude stone bowls, especially after that one enterprising mundane-born had created an electronic, holographic version that did not require one to put one's finger, or, in versions where you wished to watch the memories in third person instead of from the viewpoint of the owner, one's face, in a bowl of liquefied memories. So Death did not often indulge in the use of pensieves, but he had used them before, extensively, and so was prepared for the odd out-of-body experience and the disorienting nausea of having one's mind forcibly adjusted to the viewpoint of another person, temporarily. If the effects had been permanent, Death would not have let his shell anywhere near such a device. But, the mind-switching only lasted a few moments in the outside world, so Death was content to stand back and watch as his shell emerged from his mother's memories, gasping for breath and with a heart-wrenching whisper of James on his lips. He very politely refrained from making any sort of incestual jokes about the incident, although it was terribly tempting. Death did, in fact, possess enough tact to know that such a thing would not only be very inappropriate, but would likely cause extreme emotional distress to his shell, which was entirely counterproductive to Death's current desire to keep his shell happy and mostly sane and functioning for as long as was possible. He had this tact, yes, he just normally chose not to use it. Death watched, clinically curious, as his shell slumped to the ground beside the pensive, trembling and breathing rather heavily, and attempted to comprehend what his shell must be feeling at the moment. He, himself, was not nearly as affected. He had lost all possible attachment to his mortal parents millions of years ago. In fact, the amount of time since he'd last thought of them in anything but abstract terms would be comparable to the birth and death of 3 consecutive stars. He had watched a star die, once, many ages ago. To this day, he has never seen a sight more enrapturing than a star-going supernova, although the sight of his shell, smiling at him, was a close second. Regardless, Death could not quite grasp the upheaval his shell would be experiencing after watching the memories of his parents. He could understand, in vague terms, that such a thing would be both uplifting and distressing, but he could not empathize, no matter how much he may wish to. Such depth of emotion had long since been lost to him, and he found himself rather curious as to what it might be like to feel so strongly about something again. He knew he was capable of emotions. He had them, but they were faint, distant things that he tended to ignore unless it suited his purposes. He felt curiosity, an endless, ceaseless curiosity which had prompted him to taste the soul of a mortal for the first time with his teeth and tongue and found nirvana, and he felt amusement, always searching for the next bit of entertainment, digging his fingers into the throat of a phoenix and watching it die and be reborn again for hours as he laughed and laughed and laughed until the stars went out. And he felt anger, a cold, black void of emotion that raised worlds, cracked entire planets in half, and fractured an already shattered mind until the only thing that was left was the Pale Rider, bringer of the apocalypse, the only of his kind no matter the legends the mortals made about him and his non-existent brothers, and nothing of Harry remained at all. Those were the times when entire oceans ran crimson, when the sun was snuffed out like a candle, when entire galaxies collapsed upon themselves beneath the weight of his rage. But Death rarely felt so strongly anymore. He had been terribly young when he still lost his temper like that, only a few million years old, then, still a child in all the ways that mattered, and it had taken so very little to set him off back then. The Earth was fortunate that it never remembered its countless deaths, and that he had feared isolation enough to always reset time so that it was as if nothing had ever happened. But Death knew. He remembered those deaths, those ends of billions of worlds, and he laughed about it now that he was older, wiser, calmer, about how his tantrums had extinguished more lives than had ever existed at a single moment. As his shell bowed his head and rocked slightly on the ground, not making a noise but folding his hands above his head and gripping his own hair, Death stood quietly and watched. He extended a tendril of power to his distressed shell as he had often done when he was curious what the mortal was thinking, brushing against his mind and his soul and feeling that familiar foreign magic rise up in welcome and anger and fear and rage. Of happiness physically jerked away because it had been so long since he'd felt like this. And fear leaf gratitude he was still listening, still feeling, and he couldn't break the connection because fury, laughter, sadness, anguish, this was his shell, and he wanted to know what his shell felt. But loathing, abhorrence, disgust, anger, this was the kind of emotion that extinguished stars, that broke open worlds, that condemned galaxies to an early grave. Death severed the connection more abruptly than he otherwise might have, making his shell twitch slightly, but he was far too focused on containing the sudden maelstrom of emotion filling the void where his soul had been. Or, perhaps, he still had a soul after all. Could someone without a soul feel this much, even if the sensations were borrowed? Death could not focus on his shell or the glazed, concerned green eyes staring up at him, because if he so much as breathed he was going to end the universe. In the past, he did not have this problem. If he was bored, he entertained himself. If he was amused, he laughed. If he was angry, he killed planets. He could not allow himself to lose control as he had in the past. His shell was here, only inches away, and if he were to destroy the world he would destroy his precious shell in the process. It did not matter that he could simply wipe the slate clean and make it as if it had never happened. Death would know. Death would remember that he had killed his own shell, had ripped the life from him and then torn him from the beyond to satisfy his own whims. He would not forgive himself if that should happen, and for Death, that meant he would never forget. A hand suddenly grasped at his own, solid and present and alive, and Death found his foreign rage draining away like a sieve. Its absence left him strangely hollow, as if the anger had taken with it everything else as well, leaving him the shell he fondly called his alternate self. But Death was ancient, and experienced, and a better liar than Loki. Nothing showed on a face cracked open by a fanged grin as unforgivable eyes leered down at the exasperated, exhausted boy at his feet. With more flourish than anything he could remember doing in a long time, Death sank to one knee beside his shell and clapped a, not trembling, skeletal hand to his shoulder. I am greatly looking forward to ripping the liver out of the old mortal and devouring it in front of him. I will, of course, gladly save the best morsel for you, my shell. As predicted, his shell blanched slightly at this unseemly creative suggestion, but smiled in fond amusement regardless. Death felt the numbness recede slightly as a warmth replaced it. His shell did more than merely tolerate him, Death felt. His shell understood. Death's grin turned more genuine at the edges at the thought. Death watched as his shell's small smile turned grim, and fought with his magic so it wouldn't immediately seek out the cause of such distress and eliminate it. He had plans for the older mortal, after all, and his magic lacked the same sort of patience he possessed when it came to such things. You can have his liver, but his heart is mine. Had Death been a human being, he would have felt his breath catch. Instead, he felt his eyes turn black and his grin turn hungry. Ah, my darling shell. You are truly more and more like me every day. Death was looking forward to the day when his shell would stand up and say, bring me the stars, Death. Bring them to me so that I may wear them around my throat like jewels, and that I may adorn my crown with the sun and moon. On that day Death would bring his shell the stars, weave them into ropes and braids and thread them into his clothing, so that in his footsteps trailed the cosmos and in his laugh would be eternity. Of course, his shell might simply ask him for a sandwich instead, and Death would gladly give him that too. It was all the same, in the end, and Death laughed and imagined he would keep laughing until the day came when his shell's soul loosed its hold on the world. Then he would simply grin, and pluck a dying star from the dark reaches of space and bring it to the earth so that the mortals could in the final, worthless moments he would allow them appreciate the only thing more wondrous to him than the smile of his shell. The sight would be beautiful. Emerging from the Pensieve was the single best and worst experience of Harry's life. He was not just Harry Potter, but also Lily Evans. He loved his father, but he also loved James. And that's not even counting the near-fanatical devotion he felt towards himself as an infant. And then the clarity seemed to fade, and Harry was once again just Harry, alone in his head except for the nosy entity currently standing silently beside him. Harry was exhausted. He was emotionally numb, although resting beneath the shock and haze of nothingness lay a whirlwind of chaos and anger and love and joy and agony. He hadn't ever felt like this before, as if his entire world had just flipped itself on its axis, and then turned upside down for good measure. He was so glad, so unspeakably glad, that he had these memories, these precious few moments with his parents. He had known that his parents loved him, they had died for him, after all, but it was one thing to know it objectively, and another entirely to know it beyond a shadow of a doubt. He felt like crying, and laughing, and punching the wall hard enough to break all of his fingers. He was pretty sure death would fix them for him if he asked. And he still had those letters to go through, the mere thought of which caused a spike of not quite pain through him, and which convinced him that those could wait a while indeed. He also, quite unsurprisingly, felt a renewed sense of loathing towards Albus Dumbledore, and not entirely for the reasons he had initially assumed. Yes, he was pissed that Dumbledore had let Sirius rot in Azkaban knowing full well he was innocent. Yes, he was enraged that Dumbledore had beguiled his parents into giving up their well-protected manor and moving into the little house on Godric's Hollow. But he was also mad because Dumbledore had kept these from him. Knowingly, Dumbledore had, in his possession, the only memories of his parents in existence, and if death hadn't gone with him to Gringotts and fetched the strongbox through some sort of mystical, magical death powers, he would still have them. Harry sank to the ground and folded his hands atop his head, grabbing onto his hair for balance as he rocked back and forth absently. He wished, desperately, that he'd actually learned occlumency, because he had a feeling that would have helped a great deal in containing this well of emotion currently running rampant with his mind. He simply felt too much, and it actually hurt a little, like a bone-deep ache in all his limbs, concentrated at the back of his skull like liquid fire. He felt the questing thread of death's magic, familiar as it was to him now that Harry had learned to feel it out and watch for it. Death's magic felt like winter and the dark and forever, and it scared and enthralled him every time he sensed it prodding at him, and as soon as it touched him he felt the incredible overwhelming emotions simply shift away from him and into that thread, which alarmingly jerked away immediately as if burned. With the emotions dulled enough now that he could concentrate past them, he made a note to thank death for that. He might have had problems gathering his composure otherwise. Harry could raise his head and look up at the towering figure of death standing unnaturally still beside him. There was no telling emotion on death's face, no gleam in his eyes or wild grin tugging at pale lips. But death's magic. It felt like a storm. Come here, at the eye, but whipping out at the edges into barbed spikes and jagged blades ready to tear up the earth and upheave oceans. Harry had never felt anything like it. Not even when death had first stepped through that portal, and his unrestrained aura had sent them all crashing to their knees in horror. Then, it had been just magic. Incredibly powerful magic, yes, but just magic in the end. This magic was not just magic. This magic was emotional. Tentatively, Harry reached up and took one of Death's hands in his, hoping to maybe comfort him or ground him. Or something, and just like that, the magic stopped. There was no gradual slowing, no calming, it was simply there one moment, and gone the next as if it had never been. Harry was actually more alarmed at this sudden switch into nothingness than he was by the actual event, and even more so when Death suddenly grinned, empty, 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 that is the smile of someone dead inside, and sank to one knee beside him, clapping him on the shoulder with killing curse eyes that almost played at being human, but didn't quite make it there. It was so easy to forget, sometimes, that Death wasn't human. He acted like it, if a bit more eccentric and bloodthirsty than a usual human, and despite his unlimited power he didn't tend to give off any sort of godly signals to Harry. But this empty grin and emptier eyes, a hollow shell, how ironic, trying to mimic a human face. This was Death. This was not the Death Harry had befriended, or the Death that was the closest thing to family that he had. His parents did not count, memories did not replace a physical presence no matter how wonderful they were. This was simply Death, the end of all things, staring out of lifeless eyes with a smile that said he had seen a painting of a human once, and that the person in the painting had been screaming, but this was the best approximation of happiness he could come up with when that work of art was his only reference. And then the empty shell that had replaced Death with Death opened its mouth and spoke in a familiar rasping voice which was as false as those eyes and that smile, but was welcomed. Regardless, I am greatly looking forward to ripping the liver out of the old mortal and devouring it in front of him. I will, of course, gladly save the best morsel for you, my shell. It was delivered almost correctly, with the right inflection and almost the right amount of bloodthirstiness, but Harry could tell something was still wrong. But the words still invoked an instinctive shudder of revulsion and reluctant amusement. Because that was just the sort of thing death would do, Harry mused fondly. He would rip out Dumbledore's liver, and eat it, and would also probably save him a piece under the mistaken impression that that was something that appealed to him in the slightest. At his obvious amusement, the smile on Death's face turned more real, and Harry quietly cheered inside at this return to normality. Normality. The cheer fell slightly as Harry remembered what he'd just seen, just watched, just lived through, and realized that the thought of Death eating Dumbledore's liver wasn't quite as horrible as it had been a few moments ago. The realization frightened him, because it was even more evidence that he was slipping, but he let it go for now. He could worry about his strange shift in morals later, when he wasn't trying to make Death come alive again. The irony burned. "You can have his liver," Harry offered, grimly amused at the way this conversation was going, "but his heart is mine." And it was. Dumbledore's heart, his dreams, his fears, his hopes, they were his. Harry didn't know Death's plan for the old man, but he figured it had to do something with crushing everything the man loved and bringing down his world around his ears. That's what Harry would do, and he thought Death would probably do likewise, only better. The expression that crossed Death's face just then would have made anyone else soil their trousers, Harry was certain. His grin was slow, dark, ravenous in the way only truly feral things are, and there was something innately unsettling about the way those abyssal eyes fixed on him as if he had personally hung the sun and moon. Harry wondered, sometimes, what Death really thought about him. He was only a mortal, after all. He would live maybe 200 years, if he was lucky, and Death would still be around when the world ended. It couldn't be healthy, this attachment the entity had to him, but Harry couldn't bring himself to really care. Maybe it was because they were basically the same person, only from different points in their lives. Maybe it was because he was the only person Death had touched in Merlin knows how long, or because Harry had been so desperate for a family, any family, that he latched on to the first godlike being that came around claiming to be him from another reality. He shrugged off the thought. So what if no one else would ever understand their weird, wonderful relationship? So what if people would get the wrong ideas from Death's closeness and disregard of personal space? It worked, and it was wonderful, and Harry wouldn't change a single thing. He jolted slightly, the realization rushing through him. He wouldn't change a thing. If he could go back in time, which he could, he realized, just by asking Death, and was given the chance to save his parents, to kill Voldemort early, to stake Wormtail's head on a pike and put it in Diagon Alley for all to see, he wouldn't. Because if he did any of those things, Dumbledore would not have felt it necessary to summon a hero, and Death would not have come through to this reality. He wouldn't change a thing, because then he wouldn't have met Death. Impulsively, Harry reached out and grabbed the startled entity around the neck and hugged him tightly, unnerved by his own resolution and the chilling knowledge that he would rather his parents stay dead than lose out on his camaraderie with Death. It felt like a betrayal, almost, but he hoped they would understand. They had loved him, he knew this now, and they would want him to be happy. This odd friendship with Death made him happy. And really, Harry figured he deserved a little happiness after all he'd been through over the years. Would they be proud of him, he wondered? James and Lily? Were they disappointed with him, with how he was handling all of this? The betrayal, the theft, the manipulations? Cold fingers combed through his hair. "They will love you until the stars go out, my shell," Death's rasping voice whispered in his ear. "And after that, they shall love you still." Harry smiled. "You'd know, wouldn't you? The death of a star is a beautiful thing, dear Shell. But they shan't even notice it, too captivated by their love for you to watch as the universe dies." Harry relaxed, believing him because he was Death, and if Death didn't know how the souls of the departed felt, then who would? He did wonder, though, when Death had seen the death of a star. Those took millions billions of years to explode, and the thought of just staring at a star until it happened, doing nothing else. Well, Harry was just happy that he wouldn't have to deal with that sort of boredom like Death obviously had. He had enough trouble staying awake during Bin's class, never mind watching a star die for lack of anything better to do. Harry leaned back as Death released him and slid smoothly to his feet, grin fixed in place and twirling a vial with a memory in it that Harry didn't recognize before it vanished with a flick of his fingers. And Voldemort had wanted to be immortal. What an idiot. That's the end of this chapter. Thanks for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe for more and to help this channel grow. See you next time.
it.